Vietnam. The war America couldn't win. Hollywood couldn't resist turning real combat nightmares into box office dreams, but boy did they miss the mark with these stinkers. From tone-deaf propaganda to laughable action flops, these Vietnam films dishonored the very veterans they claimed to celebrate. Did you know John Wayne's infamous Vietnam disaster was funded by the Pentagon? Let's explore cinema's battlefield blunders that turned the hell of war into the hell of movie making. 1. The Green Berets, 1968. Director John Wayne. The Duke's Vietnam propaganda film landed like a dud grenade with critics and veterans alike. Released at the height of anti-war sentiment, this tone-deaf epic shows Wayne's Special Forces team heroically battling evil Viet Cong while teaching a skeptical reporter the righteousness of America's cause. The film infamously ends with the sun setting in the east over the South China Sea, a geography blunder that perfectly symbolized how disconnected the movie was from reality. Critics savaged it, with Renata Adler of the New York Times calling it so unspeakable, so stupid, so rotten and false that it passes through being fun, through being funny, through being camp, through everything, and becomes an invitation to grieve. Despite the critical pounding, Wayne's star power helped it earn $11 million against a $7 million budget, proving patriotic audiences would still turn out for the Duke. Behind the scenes, the Pentagon supplied soldiers, helicopters, and equipment while demanding script approval, turning it into military-approved propaganda when actual soldiers were dying by the thousands. Wayne never served in World War II due to a football injury deferment, but lectured America about Vietnam patriotism from the director's chair. Talk about missing the point entirely. The film's portrayal of Vietnamese people was particularly offensive, reducing them to either helpless villagers needing American saviors or one-dimensional villains. David Johnson, who played the skeptical reporter, later expressed regret for his participation. Even more telling, most of Wayne's Hollywood friends refused to participate in the project, seeing it as a misguided endeavor even before cameras rolled. Sometimes being a legend doesn't make you right. 2. Air America, 1990, director Roger Spottiswoode. Mel Gibson and Robert Downey Jr. should have been a comedy dream team, but this tone-deaf attempt to turn CIA drug smuggling operations in Laos into a laugh riot crashed harder than the planes they were flying. The film tried to be MASH meets Top Gun, but ended up a confusing mess that couldn't decide if it was satirizing American involvement or celebrating it. The real Air America pilots were furious with the portrayal, claiming the movie falsely depicted them as knowing participants in heroin trafficking. The film's production was plagued with problems, including the Thai government initially refusing filming permits after reading the script. Gibson reportedly called it the worst experience of my life. While Downey was deep in his pre-rehab drug problems during filming, often showing up late to set, critics weren't kind either, with Roger Ebert noting it wants to be a satire, a comedy, an adventure, and a vehicle for social criticism, but it tries to be all things to all people and fails. The box office reflected this confusion, earning only $31 million against a $35 million budget, making it a financial failure despite its star power, a reminder that not all wars make good comedies. The screenplay went through 14 different writers, explaining its tonal whiplash. Director Spottiswoode later admitted he took the job only because he needed the money after his previous film bombed. Nancy Travis, who played the female lead, said in interviews that her character was completely rewritten during production, making her performance feel disconnected from the rest of the film. Sometimes too many cooks in the writing kitchen turns a promising meal into an unpalatable mess. 3. Operation Dumbo Drop, 1995. Director Simon Windsor. Disney thought dropping an elephant into a war zone would make a heartwarming family film. They were wrong. This bizarre Disney comedy stars Danny Glover and Ray Liotta as Green Berets on a mission to deliver an elephant to a Vietnamese village as a goodwill gesture. Based loosely on a true story, the film takes a tragic war and turns it into a slapstick comedy about animal transport. The production was a nightmare, using 5 different elephants to play Bo Tot, with trainers standing just off camera. PETA protested the film's treatment of animals, especially a scene where an elephant was dropped by parachute. The filmmakers insisted no animals were harmed, but the optics weren't great for a family-friendly movie. Critics were merciless, with Owen Gleiberman of Entertainment Weekly writing it had all the authenticity of a jungle cruise. Even worse, real veterans found it insulting that their complex, traumatic experiences were reduced to elephant jokes. The film lost money at the box office with $24.7 million against a $30 million budget, a perfect example of Hollywood completely misunderstanding both the Vietnam War and basic audience tastes. Danny Glover later expressed regret for making the film, saying he took the role to work with elephants but felt the final product was disrespectful to the war's complexity. Disney's marketing team struggled to promote it, unable to decide whether to emphasize the war elements for adults or the elephant antics for kids. The company eventually removed most Vietnam War references from trailers and posters, trying to sell it as a generic adventure movie. The resulting confusion satisfied neither demographic, making it one of Disney's most awkward live-action offerings of the 1990s. 4. The Boys in Company C, 1978. Director Sidney J. Furie. before Full Metal Jacket perfected the boot camp to battlefield formula. This choppy, unfocused film tried and failed miserably. Following a group of Marines from training to combat, the film veers wildly between dark comedy, brutal warfare, and a bizarre third act centered around a soccer match against a South Vietnamese team, making viewers wonder if they're watching a war film or Victory with Sylvester Stallone. Stan Shaw, who played tough drill instructor Tyrone Washington, actually fainted during filming from heat exhaustion in the Philippines, where temperatures regularly topped 100 degrees. The production was so cheap they could only afford 2 days of helicopter filming, making battle scenes feel small and unconvincing. While it gave R. Lee Ermey his first film role as a drill instructor, years before his iconic turn in Full Metal Jacket, critics found it disjointed and underdeveloped. Vincent Canby called it a very bad film about very important issues. The movie made just $4 million at the box office and would be completely forgotten if not for being a curious footnote in Ermey's career. Sometimes being first doesn't mean being good. The screenplay was co-written by a Vietnam veteran who quit the production halfway through, feeling the director was sensationalizing the war. Several actors later complained their characters were rewritten to be more stereotypical and one-dimensional during filming. The famous boot camp scenes had to be shot 5 times because the camera kept jamming in the Philippine humidity. Even worse, the soccer match that dominates the third act was based on no actual Vietnam incident, invented purely because the filmmakers ran out of money for battle scenes. A case study in how budget problems can derail even the most well-intentioned war film. 5. Hamburger Hill, 1987, director John Irvin, named after one of the war's bloodiest battles. This film somehow makes the brutal 10-day assault on Hill 937 tedious and forgettable. Despite attempting to honor the soldiers who fought there, the movie fails with one-dimensional characters spouting cliched dialogue in between poorly choreographed battle scenes that look like they were filmed for TV. The actors underwent minimal military training before shooting, and it shows in their unconvincing portrayals. Don Cheadle, in his film debut, is wasted in a tiny role before his character is killed off. The production faced constant rain during filming in the Philippines, requiring artificial mud to be created when they actually needed dry conditions. Critics were divided, with some praising its authenticity, while others condemned its lack of character development. Richard Corliss of Time magazine dismissed it as 84 minutes of combat, 20 minutes of cliches. Even more damning, real veterans of the battle felt it failed to capture their experience, with one Hamburger Hill survivor saying, "They got the mud right, but nothing else." The film earned a meager $13.8 million at the box office, proving that good intentions don't make good cinema. The movie was financed by a producer who had never made a war film before and insisted on casting young, unknown actors to keep the budget low. This backfired when the marketing department couldn't promote it with star power. Several scenes had to be reshot because the prop weapons malfunctioned, firing blanks at unpredictable intervals. Most embarrassingly, the film's military advisor, a Vietnam veteran himself, quit mid-production, calling the director's approach Hollywood nonsense. Released the same year as Full Metal Jacket and Good Morning Vietnam, it was quickly forgotten in their shadows. 6. Missing in Action, 1984, director Joseph Zito. Chuck Norris kicks his way through Vietnam to rescue POWs in this jingoistic action mess that has all the subtlety of a roundhouse kick to the face. Made a decade after the war, this Cannon Films production was essentially Rambo for the martial arts crowd, with Norris as a former POW returning to Vietnam to rescue Americans still being held captive. The production history is almost more entertaining than the film itself. Originally planned as the sequel to a different movie, the producers decided this one was better and released it first, creating a prequel out of what was intended as the original film. Cannon Films, known for their low-budget action movies, rushed production to beat Rambo: First Blood Part 2 to theaters. Critics tore it apart, with Janet Maslin of the New York Times calling it jingoistic in the extreme. The film perpetuated the myth of abandoned POWs as a political talking point rather than addressing real veterans' issues. Despite the critical drubbing, it was a financial success for Cannon, earning $22.8 million on a $2.5 million budget and spawning 2 sequels, proof that explosions and roundhouse kicks can overcome bad screenwriting any day. Norris, a vocal conservative and martial arts champion, took the role seriously, claiming he wanted to honor POWs. In reality, he had no military experience, and most of his technical advisors had never been to Vietnam. The film's Vietnamese villains were played by Filipino actors who spoke nonsensical dialogue that wasn't even proper Vietnamese. Most hilariously, Norris performed all his own stunts except for a swimming scene because the actor couldn't swim, perhaps the perfect metaphor for a film drowning in its own absurdity while pretending to be authentic. 7. Caribe, 1987. Director Michael Kennedy. This forgotten disaster tried to combine Rambo, Platoon, and a beach vacation into one incomprehensible mess. John Savage stars as a Vietnam veteran suffering from PTSD who travels to a Caribbean island for recovery, only to find himself fighting Vietnamese pirates. Yes, you read that correctly. The film inexplicably transports Vietnam War enemies to tropical waters in a plot that makes zero historical or logical sense. The production was so troubled that several actors quit mid-filming, forcing hasty rewrites. Director Michael Kennedy later admitted he took the job solely for a paid vacation, saying, "I knew it was terrible, but the beaches were nice." The continuity errors are legendary, with characters changing clothes between shots and weapons appearing and disappearing. Critics who bothered to review it were savage. Variety called it possibly the worst Vietnam-themed film of the decade, while the few audiences who saw it were reportedly laughing at scenes meant to be dramatic. The film barely got theatrical distribution, earning less than $500,000 before vanishing into VHS obscurity. It's so bad that bootleg copies have become collector's items among bad movie enthusiasts. The film was financed by a hotel chain hoping to promote tourism to the Caribbean, explaining the bizarre beach setting for a Vietnam War story. Most of the budget went to renting yachts and beachfront properties rather than competent writers or effects. John Savage, a respected actor who appeared in The Deer Hunter, took the role only because his previous 3 films had been shelved. He later called it his career low point. The film's soundtrack featured Caribbean steel drum versions of 1960s war protest songs, perhaps the perfect audio representation of its tonal confusion. 8. Fire Base, 1972. Director Cirio H. Santiago. Before the war even ended, Filipino exploitation director Santiago tried cashing in with this shoddy action film shot in the Philippines with non-professional actors and real military surplus. Following American soldiers defending a remote fire base, the film is nothing but poorly staged gun battles, laughable dialogue, and casual racism toward Vietnamese characters who are portrayed as either faceless enemies or helpless victims. The production was so cheap they could only afford to blow up the same hut 3 times, filming it from different angles and using the footage repeatedly throughout the film. Most of the actors were actual American expatriates living in Manila, many of whom were Vietnam veterans themselves, just looking for quick cash. The few critics who saw it were merciless. One reviewer called it so incompetently made it borders on the surreal. The film never received proper distribution in America, but played for years in grindhouse theaters in Asia, where audiences reportedly threw things at the screen. Its only lasting legacy is inspiring better filmmakers on how not to make a Vietnam War movie. The weapons used in the film were leftover American military equipment sold on the black market, explaining why some scenes feature soldiers using vastly different models of rifles. Several scenes were filmed without permits on Philippine military bases, with the cast and crew posing as documentary filmmakers. The sound was recorded so poorly that every line of dialogue had to be dubbed in post-production, often by different actors than those on screen. Santiago went on to make over a dozen more Vietnam exploitation films, each worse than the last, creating a strange subgenre of Filipino-made Vietnam War movies throughout the 1970s. 9. Good Morning Vietnam, 1987, director Barry Levinson. A controversial pick for sure, but hear me out. While Robin Williams' manic performance as Armed Forces radio DJ Adrian Cronauer won him an Oscar nomination, the film presents a fictionalized Vietnam that bears little resemblance to reality. The real Cronauer later admitted he was nothing like Williams' character, never left the base, and wasn't the anti-authority rebel portrayed in the film. The production whitewashed the war for mainstream audiences, turning a brutal conflict into background scenery for Williams' improvised radio routines. Thai locations substituted for Vietnam, creating a picture postcard version of war-torn Saigon that veterans found unrecognizable. Most egregiously, the film invents a bombing of a GI hangout that never happened, using tragedy as a plot device. While commercially successful, earning $123 million worldwide and praise for Williams, Vietnam veterans groups criticized its factual inaccuracies and tone. The real Adrian Cronauer expressed discomfort with being portrayed as a hero, stating, "I was a disc jockey, not some kind of war hero." Sometimes commercial success doesn't equal historical accuracy, and this film sacrificed truth for laughs. Williams improvised so much that the script was often abandoned entirely, creating continuity problems that plagued the film. The Vietnamese characters are mostly stereotypes, with the romantic subplot particularly criticized for its exotic Asian beauty tropes. The film's writer later acknowledged that he chose to ignore most of the real Cronauer's experiences in favor of creating a star vehicle for Williams. Perhaps most telling, the film won 0 awards from veterans organizations despite being one of the highest-grossing Vietnam films ever made, a prime example of how even critically acclaimed films can fundamentally misrepresent war. 10. Apocalypse, now Redux, 2001. Director Francis Ford Coppola. Sacrilege to include this? Perhaps. While the original 1979 film is a masterpiece, Coppola's bloated 2001 Redux cut added 49 painful minutes that the editor wisely removed from the original. The infamous French plantation sequence stops the film dead, adding pointless political discussions and a random romance that contributes nothing to the journey up the river. Coppola admitted he added the sequences partly because they were expensive to shoot and he felt guilty about cutting them. Martin Sheen, who nearly died from a heart attack during the original filming, wasn't consulted about the new cut and reportedly was surprised to see scenes he'd forgotten filming suddenly appearing in theaters. Critics who had praised the original were divided on Redux. Roger Ebert called the additions a masterpiece of insanity, and not in a good way. Even Coppola seemed to recognize his mistake, later releasing a third cut called Final Cut that removed some of Redux's worst additions. The Redux version stands as a cautionary tale that sometimes less is more, and even great directors can't resist tinkering with perfection. The French plantation sequence cost over $1 million to shoot in 1976, but was cut because test audiences found it boring and preachy. When Coppola restored it for Redux, he had to spend another fortune color correcting the faded footage to match the rest of the film. Most embarrassingly, the film's original editor, Walter Murch, declined to work on Redux, believing the additional scenes damaged the film's pacing and power. Coppola's own son, Roman, reportedly told his father the Redux version was a mistake. Sometimes even cinematic geniuses need someone to tell them when they've gone too far. 11. The Quiet American, 1958, director Joseph L. Mankiewicz. This first adaptation of Graham Greene's novel completely missed the point, turning an anti-American intervention story into anti-communist propaganda. Starring Audie Murphy as the supposedly innocent American agent Alden Pyle, the film changes Greene's critique of American meddling in Vietnam into a heroic tale of fighting communism. Greene himself hated the adaptation so much he refused to allow his name in the credits. The production was supported by the CIA, who pressured the filmmakers to alter the novel's message. The real scandal was casting Murphy, America's most decorated World War II veteran, in a role that was supposed to represent American naivety and destructive foreign policy. The Vietnamese locations were beautiful, but the portrayal of local people was stereotypical and borderline racist. Critics at the time were mixed, but modern reassessments have been brutal. Graham Greene called it a betrayal of his work, and the 2002 remake with Michael Caine corrected many of its political distortions. The film remains a fascinating example of Cold War propaganda disguised as entertainment, completely missing the prophetic warnings about American involvement in Vietnam that the novel offered. Director Mankiewicz later admitted he'd never read Greene's novel before accepting the job, relying entirely on the studio's sanitized screenplay. The Vietnamese government initially welcomed the production, not realizing the political changes made to the story, and later banned the film from being shown in the country. Actor Michael Redgrave, who played the British journalist, tried to quit multiple times during filming, uncomfortable with the propaganda aspects. He stayed only after being threatened with a lawsuit, but later called it the biggest mistake of my career, a perfect case study of how Hollywood could completely miss the point of a great novel. 12. Bat 21, 1988, director Peter Markle. Gene Hackman and Danny Glover can't save this dull, sanitized account of a real rescue mission. Based on the story of Lieutenant Colonel I.C.L. Hambleton, a 53-year-old Air Force navigator shot down behind enemy lines, the film reduces complex military operations to golf metaphors as Hackman's character uses golf courses he remembers to navigate to safety. The real mission involved the deaths of 11 American soldiers and airmen during rescue attempts, which the film barely acknowledges. The production simplified the actual 12-day rescue operation and invented a buddy dynamic between Hambleton and his rescuer that never existed. Most egregiously, it completely erased the South Vietnamese soldiers who participated in the actual rescue. Critics found it formulaic and boring, with Hal Hinson of the Washington Post writing it has all the excitement of watching a round of golf on television. Veterans criticized its technical inaccuracies and overly simplified portrayal of warfare. With a box office take of just $3.1 million, audiences clearly agreed, a reminder that even true stories can make for false cinema. The real Hambleton served as a technical advisor but reportedly walked off the set when the director ignored his input about the actual events. The film's golf course navigation concept was factually accurate but exaggerated to ridiculous extremes for the movie. Most bizarrely, the filmmakers obtained permission to shoot at a real Air Force base but were kicked out mid-production when military officials reviewed daily footage and found it disrespectful to actual combat operations. They completed filming on hastily constructed sets that looked nothing like actual military installations, explaining the film's cheap TV movie appearance. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree with these choices? Which Vietnam films do you think are the worst? Would you defend any of these movies? Should Hollywood continue making Vietnam War films, or has the subject been exhausted? The Vietnam War remains one of America's most controversial conflicts, and perhaps some stories are better left untold than told poorly. Maybe we're still too close to understand it fully. The best war films honor those who served served by telling the truth, not by wrapping patriotism in fantasy? Do these failures dishonor veterans more than no movies at all would have? That's a question worth debating.